All right, so we're diving into the West Memphis 3 case today.
Mhm.
It's a wild one, full of twists and turns, and honestly, it's a case that just leaves you with more questions than answers.
Oh, yeah, this one's a doozy. And, I think it really highlights how easily a story can kind of spiral out of control when you throw in fear, public pressure, and, well, a whole lot of societal anxieties.
Right. I mean, you start with a horrific crime, 3 8-year-old boys murdered, and then things just get, well, weird.
Weird is putting it mildly.
So we've got court documents, we've got documentaries, investigative reports, even statements from some of the key players in this whole thing. We're going to try to unpack it all, but let me tell you, it's a journey.
It really is. And I think what's so fascinating about this case is that it's not just about a whodunit. It's about how narratives get created, how they get amplified, and how they can sometimes, well, completely derail the pursuit of justice.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. May 5th, 1993, 3 8-year-old boys, Steve Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore go missing in West Memphis, Arkansas.
Small town, quiet, Nobody expected something like this to happen.
Their bodies are found the next day in a drainage ditch. And the condition of the bodies, especially the injuries on Christopher Byers, well, it sent shockwaves through the community.
It was brutal. And understandably, people were terrified.
And, I mean, it's the early 90s. The satanic panic was in full swing. So people immediately started whispering about satanic cults and ritualistic killings.
Right, which is exactly when the narrative starts to take over. Instead of focusing on the actual evidence, the investigation starts to get driven by this preconceived notion of who might have committed such a crime.
And that's where the West Memphis Three come in. Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. They were teenagers, outsiders into heavy metal. And Eccles, well, he was into the occult.
In a community gripped by fear and suspicion, they became the perfect scapegoats.
But I'm already wondering, was their differentness really the only thing that made them suspects? Was there any real evidence?
Well, there are a few things, but nothing concrete. Like they found some green threads and a red fiber at the crime scene that were supposedly microscopically similar to clothing found in Eccles and Baldwin's homes.
Fibers. That seems a bit thin, doesn't it? I mean, wouldn't fibers like that be pretty common?
You're telling me. And you know what's even crazier? No DNA evidence ever linked any of the three teenagers to the crime scene.
Okay, so no DNA. What else did they have?
Well, there was Jesse Miskelly Jr.'s confession.
Ah, confession.
Except it was problematic from the get-go. He was 17 years old, had a low IQ, and guess what? They interrogated him for hours without his parents present.
Wait, hold up. They questioned a minor without his parents there. That doesn't sound right at all.
It raises a lot of red flags, ethically and legally. And to top it off, the confession itself was full of inconsistencies. Miskelly's story kept changing, he contradicted known facts about the crime scene, and he even later recanted, saying that the police coerced him.
So we've got a confession that's shaky at best, some generic fibers, and the fact that these teenagers listened to heavy metal. Anything else?
Well, there was one more piece of the puzzle, and this one is interesting. A woman named Vicki Hutchison.
I've heard that name before. Wasn't she the one who claimed that Eccles had confessed to the murders?
That's the one. She told the police this wild story about Eccles bragging about the murders at some Wiccan meeting. But when they pressed her for details, she couldn't remember where this meeting took place or who else was even there.
Sounds pretty flimsy to me.
You're not wrong, but you have to remember the context. The community was terrified, and this satanic panic narrative had taken root. People were desperate for answers, and Hutchison, well, she provided them with an answer that fit their fears.
So the police have this narrative, they have suspects who fit the narrative, and now they have a witness who backs up the narrative, even if her story is a bit all over the place. It's almost like they were trying to jam the square peg into the round hole, you know.
And that's one of the big problems with this case. It feels like the investigation was more about finding a quick and easy solution than about actually uncovering the truth. And here's the thing. They may have even ignored other potential suspects who didn't fit their narrative.
Hold on, there were other suspects. Who are we talking about?
Well, there were these two teenagers, Chris Morgan and Brian Holland. They actually left West Memphis and headed to California shortly after the murders. Both of them failed polygraph tests, and get this, Morgan even confessed at one point.
He confessed? And then what?
He recanted, but still, it seems like a pretty big lead to just ignore.
Right. Why wouldn't the police dig into that more?
It's a good question. Why were these leads just dropped while they kept focusing on Eccles and his friends? Was it tunnel vision? Or were they so convinced that they had the right guys that they didn't bother to look anywhere else?
It almost feels like they were so determined to blame these murders on some satanic cult
Yes.
that they ignored anything that didn't fit that story.
And there's another detail that muddies the waters even further. The Mr. Bojangles incident. Apparently, an employee at a Bojangles restaurant reported seeing a mentally disoriented black man, covered in blood, in the restroom on the night of the murders.
Whoa, a man covered in blood. That's a
Yeah.
huge detail. Did they ever find this guy?
Nope. Never identified him. And to make things even more intriguing, they found a hair at the crime scene that belonged to an unidentified black male.
So we've got these other potential suspects, this Mr. Bojangles lead, a hair that doesn't match any of the West Memphis Three. And yet, none of this seemed to make the police question their theory.
It is baffling, isn't it? But that's the thing about narratives. Once they take hold, it can be really hard to shake them loose, even when the evidence starts pointing in a different direction. And speaking of evidence, that brings us to the trials. You'd think that with such a weak case with so many unanswered questions, the prosecution would have a tough time convincing a jury, right?
You'd think so, yeah. I mean, how do you convict someone of murder with so little actual evidence?
Well, you lean hard into the narrative.
Oh boy, here we go. Tell me they didn't.
They went full-on satanic panic.
So they actually used the whole satanic angle in court. Serious?
Oh, yeah. They went all in, painted these teenagers as devil worshippers, capable of anything, even brought in a so-called occult expert to testify.
An occult expert. Come on, was this guy even legit?
His credentials were, let's just say they were questionable at best.
But they let him testify anyway.
They did. And, in that climate of fear, with everyone on edge about satanic cults, it's not hard to imagine that his testimony had an impact on the jury.
Okay, so we've got a terrified community, a prosecutor pushing this satanic narrative, and now an expert on the occult. It sounds like a recipe for disaster. What happened? Were they convicted?
Yep. Damian Eccles was sentenced to death. Jason Baldwin got life in prison. And Jesse Miskelly, because he was a minor and because his confession was so iffy, got life with the possibility of parole.
It's mind-blowing. They were convicted based on a story, on a narrative, not on actual evidence.
And that's what makes this case so disturbing. It shows how easily justice can get derailed when fear and prejudice take over.
So what happened next? Did they appeal? Did anyone try to fight these convictions?
Oh, yeah. The fight to free the West Memphis Three became a huge thing. Celebrities got involved, activists, legal experts. Everybody was talking about this case.
Oh, I remember hearing about that. There were those documentaries, Paradise Lost, right?
Exactly. Those documentaries really brought the case to light. And then, as DNA technology advanced, people started to think, maybe there's a way to prove their innocence.
So did they test the evidence? What happened?
In 2007, they finally did. And guess what? No DNA from Eccles, Baldwin, or Miskelly was found at the crime scene. Not a trace.
Whoa, that's huge. I mean, that basically blows their whole case out of the water, right?
It should have. But even with this new evidence, it wasn't a clear path to freedom. The legal system, it's a complicated beast.
So what happened then? Did they get a new trial?
Well, things were moving in that direction. But then, another twist. They found a hair at the crime scene. And guess whose DNA it matched?
Don't tell me. One of those other suspects.
Nope. It matched Terry Hobbs, Stevie Branch's stepfather.
Wait, the stepfather? Are you serious?
Yep. And it gets even more interesting. Stevie's mother, Pamela Hobbs, said that she found her son's pocket knife in Terry's stuff after the murders.
Hold on. So now we have no DNA from the West Memphis Three. We have a hair that belongs to the stepfather and a missing knife that shows up at his things. Why wasn't he ever a suspect?
It's a question a lot of people have been asking. Why were they so focused on these teenagers when there were other potential leads that pointed closer to home?
This is infuriating. It's like they just wanted to pin it on someone, anyone, who fit their narrative. What did Terry Hobbs say about all of this? Did he deny it?
He's always maintained his innocence. He even sued people who publicly accused him. But you can't deny that the new evidence, especially with the DNA, really cast a shadow over the whole case.
So what happened? Did they finally get a retrial with all of this new evidence?
It was a long and complicated legal battle. There were appeals, hearings, setbacks, and just when it seemed like a retrial was inevitable, something unexpected happened.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What happened? Don't leave me hanging.
In 2011, after spending 18 years in prison, the West Memphis Three, they took a plea deal.
A plea deal. But they were innocent. Why would they plead guilty?
It's called an Alford plea. It's a weird legal thing. It allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution might have enough evidence to get a conviction.
So they're saying, we didn't do it, but we'll plead guilty just to get out of prison.
Basically, yeah. It was a way for them to finally walk free after all those years.
I don't even know what to say. It's a victory, but it's also incredibly messed up. They're free, but they still have this conviction on their record. Did anyone ever apologize for what happened to them?
There were some interesting developments after they got out. John Mark Byers, Christopher Byers' adoptive father, remember him?
Yeah, he was pretty adamant about their guilt, wasn't he?
Well, after the plea deal, he came out and said he believed they were innocent.
He did. What made him change his mind?
He said the near evidence, especially the DNA in Terry Hobbs's hair, convinced him that they had the wrong guys. He actually became a big advocate for exonerating them.
Wow. That's a pretty major shift. So where does that leave us? Were they ever officially exonerated?
Unfortunately, no. The Alford plea prevents them from suing the state, and their convictions are still technically on the books. And to add another layer of complexity, the murders are still officially unsolved.
So no justice for the victims,
Mhm.
and the guys who are wrongly convicted are still dealing with the fallout. It's a lot to process.
It is. The West Memphis 3 case is a tangled web, man. It's a story about fear, prejudice, and the very real possibility of injustice. It's a case that raises a ton of questions about how we investigate crimes, how we perceive guilt and innocence, and how easily we can be swayed by a narrative, even when the evidence doesn't quite add up.
So we've heard a lot about the investigation, the trials, the plea deal, and the lingering doubts about the West Memphis Three's guilt. But I'm curious, what do the experts have to say about all of this?
Well, one of the most interesting perspectives comes from John E. Douglas. He's a pretty renowned FBI criminal profiler.
The Mindhunter guy?
That's the one. He's worked on some of the biggest cases out there, and he actually took a look at the West Memphis 3 case.
Oh, wow. Okay, so what did he think? I mean, this guy knows his stuff, right?
Yeah.
What did he see that maybe everyone else missed?
Well, after looking at the evidence, Douglas said that the crime scene pointed toward a single perpetrator, someone who had a personal connection to the victims.
That's interesting. So not a group of teenagers acting out a satanic ritual.
Nope. Douglas was pretty adamant about that. He said it looked more like a crime of passion,
Right.
driven by rage, maybe a desire for revenge, something a lot more personal than some kind of occult ceremony.
That does make more sense, especially when you think about how the police might have overlooked other suspects who had a connection to the victims. Did Douglas have any ideas about who this single perpetrator might be?
He didn't name names, but he did give a possible profile. He said this person probably had a history of violence, and they definitely knew the victims in the area really well. He also didn't buy the whole ritualistic mutilation thing. He thought the injuries on Christopher Byers were more likely caused by animals after death.
Which, again, makes you wonder if the police were just so focused on the satanic angle that they missed other more realistic possibilities. So we've got this big-time FBI profiler saying that the whole foundation of the prosecution's case is shaky. What other expert opinions are out there?
Well, I think it's important to mention the victims' families, because they're not all on the same page about this case. Some of them, like John Mark Byers, came to believe that the West Memphis Three were innocent, but others still think they're guilty.
Man, that's got to be tough. It's a reminder that there isn't always a clear answer, you know. And even within a family, people can have totally different interpretations of what happened. It's heartbreaking no matter how you look at it.
It is. And it's a case that just keeps drawing people in. I mean, you've got documentaries, books, music, even a movie about this whole thing. It really struck a nerve with people.
It's definitely more than just a legal case at this point. It's become a cultural phenomenon. And I think that says a lot about our fascination with justice, with truth, and with the idea that sometimes, even with all the evidence and all the experts, we still might not get the answers we're looking for.
Exactly. It's a case that forces us to confront the fact that sometimes there is no neat and tidy ending. Sometimes the truth is messy, complicated, and maybe even unknowable.
And that's a tough pill to swallow, especially when you're talking about something as serious as murder.
So we've gone deep into this case, looked at the evidence, heard from the experts, and I'm curious, what's sticking with you? What are you still thinking about?
You know, for me, it's the power of a story. How a narrative can take on a life of its own, especially when you combine fear, prejudice, and media attention. It's a reminder to always be critical, to question what we're told, and to dig a little deeper. What about you?
Well, I think what gets me is the uncertainty of it all. The West Memphis 3 case shows us that sometimes, even with all the investigations and trials, the truth can still remain a mystery.
And that's a really unsettling thought, right? We want certainty. We want answers. But this case reminds us that sometimes we just don't get them.
Yeah. So here we are all these years later, and the big questions are still hanging out there. If the West Memphis Three didn't do it, then who did? And what does this whole thing say about our justice system, about the possibility that innocent people can be convicted, especially when fear and prejudice are in the mix? It's a lot to ponder.
This deep dive has been a trip, man. It's made me think about justice, about guilt and innocence, and about how easy it can be to get things wrong, especially when the stakes are so high.
It's a case that makes you question everything. And I think that's a good thing. It reminds us to stay vigilant, to keep asking questions, and to never stop fighting for a justice system that is actually just.
Well said. And to all of you listening, thanks for coming along on this deep dive. It's a case that will stay with me, and I hope it encourages all of you to stay curious, to keep digging for the truth, and to never be afraid to challenge the narratives that we're told.